Hi, I'm Shana Meyerson with the Yoga of War podcast, here today with British journalist and commentator Jonathan Sacerdoti. If you appreciate and find value in these important discussions, please consider supporting the show so I can continue to bring you such amazing and esteemed guests. Details are pinned in the comments below. On November 28th, 2024, the Oxford Union proved itself to be a pathetic kangaroo court as it feigned to debate a resolution that Israel is an apartheid state guilty of committing genocide in Gaza. Opening the arguments for the pro-Israel side was journalist Jonathan Sacerdoti, who faced a rabidly hostile and condescending audience with inconceivable grace, poise, and composure. The vote supporting the resolution was a foregone conclusion, as the gallery was deliberately stacked with vehemently anti-Israel and even terrorist sympathizing observers. Yet Jonathan and his fellow teammates, Natasha Hausdorff, Mosab Hassan Youssef, and Yosef Haddad, provided legally irrefutable proof that Israel is, in fact, neither an apartheid nor a genocidal state. Why is this event so important? Not because a bunch of jihadi university students upheld a ludicrous declaration against the world's only Jewish state, but because this is the frightening pattern plaguing the youth of Western civilization. Our campuses have become cesspools of moral decay that find justice in terror, have no interest or respect for historical facts, and roundly denounce Judeo-Christian values. And these are our future world leaders. Today, Jonathan and I will discuss his experience at Oxford Union and what is and isn't genocide and apartheid under international law, and why you, as a human, should care. Jonathan Sacerdoti is a journalist and commentator specializing in global affairs, culture, and society, with over 15 years of experience reporting on Israel and the Middle East. A UK correspondent for Israeli TV channel I24 News, Jonathan has also contributed to major media outlets such as Fox News, BBC, Sky News, and the Jewish Chronicle. He co-founded a leading UK anti-Semitism charity, served as a Simon Wiesenthal Center UK trustee, and helped to save the Jewish Chronicle from bankruptcy. As the son of a Holocaust survivor, Jonathan is committed to fighting anti-Semitism and addressing extremism, regularly speaking at schools, universities, and public forums. And these days, on a lot of podcasts. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining mine today.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Shana, and for the lovely and warm introduction. It's really great to be with you.
Thank you. After watching your speech over and over and over, besides the jaw drop of how composed you maintained yourself, as I read, I hear my voice in this lovely British accent. It's just not coming through the way I intended to. So I'd like to start off, you and also Natasha, who was on the team with you, are a graduate of Oxford University. You participated in the Oxford Union as a student. So I guess before we begin, can we set the stage? Like, what is the Oxford Union and what is the typical protocol for a debate?
So the Oxford Union is actually an independent body from the University of Oxford. It's set up with that independence so that traditionally it could tackle topics that might once historically have been too sensitive for a university society to tackle. But in effect, it's a student society for debating. And it's another few things as well. So debating, for those who don't know, is a sort of intellectual pursuit that it's quite historic. It's a bit like what you see in Parliament here. But the format of a debate at the Oxford Union or the Cambridge Union. Indeed, there are schools debates and things like that for people of school age as well, like high school rather than university age. It's that a certain number of speakers on either side of a motion discuss a topic, and the motion will be something along the lines of "this House believes," and then the statement that is up for debate. So in this case, they chose a nice, moderate and rational one. This House believes that Israel is an apartheid state responsible for genocide, the double whammy, and they had 4 speakers on either side, or at least that was the original plan. And what happens in a debate is that the speakers alternate: first proposition, first opposition, second proposition, second opposition, and so on. And during the debate, anyone in the room, including the audience, can stand up during the speeches and offer a point of information, which is meant to be an interjection that is relevant to what's being said at that exact moment. And the speaker can choose to accept it or not to accept it. And if he accepts it, he should respond to it, I suppose. And that's that. And it's all chaired by a chairman, who in this case was the president of the Oxford Union in that term, which was an Egyptian kid called Ibrahim Osman Mawafi. And he had made a big deal in the press before then of being the first Arab president of the Oxford Union. So that's the format. It's meant to be quite a civilized and mannered affair. It's meant to be a polite, intellectual way of tackling a topic, however contentious. And both sides are meant to spar with one another rhetorically and logically in order to help the audience make their minds up. And then at the end, there's a vote. In the case of the Oxford Union, people leave by one or the other side of a door, one side for yes, one side for no, and they count up the votes at the end, and that is how the House, so to speak, decides what it believes. So that's the format, but that's not quite what happened on that night in the Oxford Union, as maybe you've seen online.
It sounds really civilized. And before, yes, I did see everything online, including the unedited versions, thanks to your mom that you recorded that for her, it sounds like. But on the topic of civility, before we go any further, and this is an honest question, your team had 8 bodyguards. Is it at all typical for an Oxford Union debater to have a bodyguard, much less 2 apiece?
Yeah, I don't think so. What really happened with this debate was it was very clear from the moment of invitation that it was likely to be contentious, let's say. So I fully expected that we would go there and have to make a strong case and hope that there's a room full of intelligent, open-minded people, which you might hope would be typical of students at one of the best universities in the world. And regardless of that, it's clear that these days when you go onto university campuses, things aren't calm on this topic. So I did consult with someone I know who deals with security for events and things like this, and I was quite surprised by the assessment that he came back with. He liaised with the in-house security at the Oxford Union and with the police, the local police, who were going to be there because there was likely to be a protest outside, as there often is when there's anything to do with Israel going on inside. And the long and the short of it is that they said, yes, you should have 8 people providing security, and you should have a car ready to take you away very quickly should anything go wrong, which is a little surprising for me. I will say I'm not used to having to do that when I speak publicly on really any topic. I mean, there have been once or twice when I've had to, but that was a surprise. So from then on, I think we knew that it was likely this would not go typically, and it certainly didn't. I mean, the atmosphere in the room was horrible from the moment we walked in. When we walked in, everyone was already in place. The other team was in place opposing us, or all of the audience were in place, very carefully arranged, it seemed, so that the most aggressive people would be directly behind us, in the row behind us. And that's not speculation on my part. I've heard from people who were in there who actually know how people were directed as they came in, who was sent where. That was just the start of it. But as you can see in the videos, people heckled, screamed, jumped out of their seats, cursed us in English and in Arabic. There was quite a lot of Arabic being shouted in the room. at me and the other speakers. Two of my team were Arabic speakers, they're Arabs. They understood the insults being thrown at them. I even understood one of them when they yelled at Mosab Hassan Youssef that he was sharmut, means whore or prostitute, very early on in his speech, which, by the way, is no small insult at the best of times, but this is somebody who famously was sexually abused as a child when he was living among Palestinian society, his father being a spiritual leader in Hamas, the terrorist organization. So particularly within Arab culture, if you've been the victim of some form of sexual abuse, there is a shame and a sense of there having been something wrong with you for having been the victim. So particularly in that context, I think it was a very nasty and wounding insult to throw his way. And I just think that really, if anything, epitomizes the level of, or the low level of behaviour that was typical for that entire evening. And I mean, I encourage anyone to watch the videos because, as you said, the Oxford Union did release, as they normally do, the individual speeches as individual videos on their YouTube. But they made the peculiar decision in my speech to censor it, not to censor what I said actually, but to censor the abuse that was thrown at me. 2 solid minutes of abuse were just muted, and the camera was locked off to a sort of wide shot, so you couldn't really see what was going on. But as you mentioned, I happened to have recorded it on my iPhone as I spoke so that I could WhatsApp it to my mum, who'd asked to hear what I said in the event. She wasn't able to be there, and thank goodness. So when I got home and when they did release the video eventually, I realized that perhaps somebody should dub on the full sound that I had onto the video that they'd released. And that video itself, because of the really not typical behavior for the Oxford Union, a very old and esteemed establishment, has gone massively viral. On my X account, it has over 1 million interactions. In my YouTube, I think probably 250,000. And I say all this not to congratulate myself for those people having seen the video, though I'm delighted that many people have heard and are continuing to hear what I had to say on the topic, but because I think it shows the level of shock around the whole world at how something as symbolic as the Oxford Union being so deeply trashed as it was, that it's such a symbolic moment, I think, for many people to have seen. And that has really struck me, as I get still to this day emails and messages from people all around the world telling me how disgusted they were.
Yeah, I could tell you that personally. I watched you really with a combination of absolute awe over your dignity and diplomacy. I don't know how you held it together the way that you did. I'm sort of giggling because Mosab versus you, there was a little bit of a different composure element. And
I like to say that, I mean, here's the thing. The funny thing about it is they booked the speakers also in quite a calculated way. I think they wanted us to lose before we started.
Sure.
So they booked on the anti-Israel side, the proposition, they booked 2 Jewish speakers, and I think they thought that was clever. Norman Finkelstein and Miko Peled, both of them quite infamous anti-Israel speakers, but quite an aggressive and I would say not very intellectual or calm way. There are versions of that debate that could have been calm and intellectual, but I think that choice of speaker wasn't. So when we ended up, through a few pullings out and cancellations, suggesting to them that they should invite Yossef Haddad and Mosab Hassan Youssef on our side, and they reluctantly did, we ended up with 2 Arabs on our side, which to some extent disproved the whole apartheid allegation just by their presence. But also, I think it did something interesting, which is, as you say, maybe I had the polite, restrained version, and they got very heated, understandably. As I said, they could understand more of the insults than I could. But also, they brought a bit of Middle East to a debate about the Middle East. So I think that the 2 of them actually spoke absolutely brilliantly on quite different topics because they have very different backgrounds and expertise. And also their style was more passionate because I think that, quite understandably, they were absolutely incensed about what happened.
I agree. And believe me, believe me, I would have been the Mosab in that room. There is no way, literally no way I would have been able to contain myself the way that you did. I'm suddenly curious. I mean, you're saying on one hand that there was no way you could have been prepared for such unbridled hostility, but at the same time, you and Natasha as well. And again, this is no like incrimination of Mosab and of Youssef. I thought they were both phenomenal, but I'm just saying that how. Just is it because you have so much experience in front of a camera? Like, how did you even maintain your composure? I was seething. Of course, they were behind you, so you couldn't see. Like, I mean, you can now, but you couldn't see like the women behind you, who were literally snickering at everything you said, including about your father being a Holocaust survivor. Like that set the stage. It was so distracting, sorry, for me to even have to have them on screen. And it's interesting that you say that they were purposely put there because they were definitely playing the part. Yeah.
Well, I think the answer is well, there's a few answers. Well, the first most honest one is I don't really know, but I also I think it's part of my personality and general approach to life that in a crisis I keep quite calm. So it's an interesting and I think quite useful feature that if I'm involved in some kind of disaster or crisis in a personal sense, I'm often able to maintain a level of calm that helps me work out what to do and see things broadly and try to figure out a response. And often you'll find that if that is the case, you get home and maybe when it's all finally over, it suddenly hits you and you're exhausted or distraught or whatever it might be. But in that case, I have to say I went in there as well, not expecting exactly what we got, but I did expect something. And I had gone in there saying to my colleagues who were, on this team with me, I said, if you're worried, if you're nervous, because there were a few nerves I could see among some, I said, don't be. It's children in black tie. And I think that having been a student in Oxford, that was helpful because I think that to somebody that doesn't even come from the UK, never mind from having gone through that university themselves, it can be very intimidating. It looks a bit like Harry Potter, all these ancient buildings and fancy costumes and all of that. In fact, some of the Harry Potter movies were in fact filmed in Oxford colleges. So I think that level of intimidation just wasn't there for me. None of that worried me in the least bit. And I don't say it patronizingly that they're children in suits, but at the end of the day, generally speaking, when I go to make an argument or a discussion or a debate with anybody, I know that they are just like me, another human being there with an opposing view. And it's my job to rationally and calmly discuss it with them. In this case, for the purposes of an audience in the room and a wider audience who will later watch it on video. And I just know that if you have confidence and belief in what you're saying and it's based on truths and facts and you're comfortable in your position, then there's really not much need to start screaming and shouting and swearing and cursing. And in the end, when I was interrupted and stopped from speaking quite so much and abused quite so horribly as I was, that's the message I gave them. I mean, that, I diverted somewhat from what I'd gone there to say at one point, just to say, I've got it. There are people in here who don't agree with us. In fact, it's very clear you don't like us because of our opinions. But the whole purpose of this place and this debate is that we can have a polite conversation and we can try to base things on fact and argument and reason and interact with each other so that the audience there, who maybe know less than the experts who've been invited, can go away better informed, maybe with the same view they had, maybe with an opposite view or something in between. But certainly you don't do that by shrieking and disrupting. That's clearly something that people do to stop there being a reasoned conversation. And I would say that usually when that's your approach, it's because you're afraid that your side is actually not correct or is wrong, or to be as charitable as I can be, that you just allow your emotions to absolutely override your ability to think openly and rationally and to keep your mind focused on intelligent thought. So either way, they were, I think, demonstrating how not to have a reasoned debate. And that's really what I went there for. So that's what I did either way.
Sure. And I think that there's a certain fallacy in the assumption that we live in a world that cares about facts. I mean, there's no doubt that what you provided, again, just simply by Yosef and Mosab, like even being there, incontrovertible evidence. I mean, that you can't say that Israel's an apartheid state. And by the way, here's a guy who is a commander in the IDF who happens to be Arab, and the Jews saved his life when he was injured. Like you just like they provided their own proof. I want to, just because I have no idea how Oxford Union works, I do have one more question, and forgive my ignorance on this. So the dual slander of the resolution itself, this House believes Israel is an apartheid state engaged in genocide, reminds me a lot of the South African allegations at the ICJ, because those also, like, they didn't ask the court to examine whether actual international law abuses were being perpetrated by Israel in Gaza, but instead they just asked the court to rule on their allegations as if they were already a given. Guilty until proven innocent. So is it normal to state a resolution that is so resolute that the House believes this very negative thing, or is it usually something more neutral that lends itself to actual debate? And by the way, it sort of predicates one on the other. It also reminds me of, like, in the US Congress when they're like, okay, we have an Israel bill, but we're going to attach it to something having to do with electrical cars, so that you have to, pass both of these motions or neither of the motions. And I know there's a genocide, so therefore it must also be apartheid.
So I think that part's interesting, actually, because you're right that even if you did think that Israel is an apartheid state, you might not think it's carrying out a genocide. Or if you thought it was carrying out a genocide, you might not think it's an apartheid state. They're not mutually, they could exist in isolation. So I think that there is something to be said about the choice of motion having been both of them. And in pure debating terms, I don't want to make this about the intellectual sport of debating, because this never was about that as far as I was concerned from the word go. In those terms, yes, it's sort of, as a logical position, it should be easy to disprove, because there are logical, or rather legal, definitions for both those phrases, genocide and apartheid. There are international legal conventions, and you could prove or disprove according to those. And then, as you said, they don't necessarily have to both be true. But I think that more broadly speaking, what we experienced was the idea that it was a debate about whether Israel is good or bad. And these are the two catchphrases that encapsulate that in modern, especially younger people's language. And I think that that's been a major problem for the state of Israel during this war, but also for long before. There's been something called Israel Apartheid Week that's taken place on some campuses around the world, including here in the UK, for many years. And mostly people let it go as a sort of loony activity that some extreme students did. Students often take very extreme views on issues, especially geopolitical ones or international affairs issues that they may not fully understand. We've all been young once, and I think the passion of youth and the feeling that you ought to have a very strong position on important issues is something we can recognise. But I think that often there are young people who understand, and more people as they grow older understand, that sometimes you need a lot more knowledge before you can be quite so certain or quite so strident in your views about certain very complex things. And sometimes things aren't black and white. Sometimes, as I often say about Israel, the choices that state has to make are often between something quite bad and something worse. There aren't often very good choices because of the ruthlessness and lack of ethics or morals that its enemies have. It means that sometimes the decisions that Israel has to make are extremely tough because all options are quite unpleasant. And at the same time, Israel is a state that tries very hard to adhere to a very high moral standard and to the requirements of international law. And, that's its aspiration as a state and always has been, that it should be exemplary and compliant as other states are. Not that it, can be supernaturally good in ways that other states aren't, but that, like America, like the UK, like France, it will make mistakes. But generally speaking, these democratic, westernized states, Israel's somewhat Western, somewhat Middle Eastern, try to be ethical and principled and to adhere with international law. So I think that the motion and the mood and generally the whole setup was one that was more about emotions and feelings than it was about facts and figures or logic and argument. And I think that that's fundamentally one of the things that people really saw very clearly that night, and in the videos of that night since, that there is a massive shift in how young people, even at our elite universities, think. They are utterly guided, generally speaking, by their emotions and their perceptions, often without the modifying factor of their critical thought. And I think that that's a really interesting shift that's happened, and it's one that we're going to have to all face moving forwards in life, because we have bred a generation or two who are almost blind sometimes in certain issues to facts and critical thinking, because they're just so strongly led by emotions. And emotions are very easily manipulated by people who have ulterior motives or by other people who simply have very strong emotions. And that's somewhat contagious. So I'm a bit old-fashioned in that I believe that we should all, each one of us, strive to have a critical outlook on pretty much anything. And I always say that even when I have an opinion, I often look very strongly at the opposing points to it in order to test the opinion myself. If it's something that I also feel is not a nice opinion to have, I'm all the more likely to try to test it. And at the point at which I decide it's still right, that's when I feel, well, it might be difficult to say it, it might make some people upset, but here goes, because I really feel like I've done my homework, I've done the research, and this is how I think it is. And so that's the attitude I went there with. I knew that some people would find it difficult to hear what I had to say, but I wanted to say it to them respectfully. And all I asked was that they would hear it respectfully and let me say it respectfully, and we could have a debate or a discussion about it. And as I said, once again, that just didn't happen.
Sure. Going back to the concept of how patient and really generous you are with your view of these kids as just being young and emotional. I personally, and you said it at least once, if not twice, during your speech, that this is about seeing another point of view. I don't see that at all. I see it as acknowledging facts. A point of view, again, is going back more to the concept of emotions. But if I tell you that this jacket is white, that doesn't make it a valid point of view. It's not.
Oh, look, I agree with that. And I will say that, there are objective facts. But when it comes to something like what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, I wouldn't say that everything is black and white, clear as day, and that there are no arguments or discussions to be had. However, when it comes to apartheid or genocide, I feel very strongly that those words are being massively misused in this context. And that's why I did choose to try to set them in some historical context. You don't have a long time in those speeches. They're meant to be 9 minutes long. They did overrun. But I decided, given the sloppy treatment that we were given, that I really ought to just finish what I had to say, regardless of the interruptions. And sure enough, the one thing I think I could praise them for is that they did allow pretty much everyone to speak as long as they needed in the end. Only the first speaker on the other side actually didn't have enough to say to fill up his time. But that's more a reflection, I think, on his abilities to think critically and to argue persuasively. But you know what? He didn't need to persuade the room. They all agreed with him. We're talking about the fact they got standing ovations before they started, which is fine. People can have the opinions they have. But yes, when it comes to right and wrong, in certain senses, I feel that October the 7th was very much a turning point in contemporary history, if such a thing can exist, in the modern world. And I say that because it really was horrific. It was beyond previous actions of Hamas. It was beyond previous wars. Everything here has been massively different. And as someone that's covered previous Israeli military engagements and previous terror attacks in Israel and has covered the area for a while, I can say safely that, the moment I saw what was happening that morning, when I reached for my phone in bed as I woke up, I knew this was one of those days which would mark in my life everything before it and everything after it. What perhaps I didn't realize, and many of us came to realize quite soon afterwards, is it wasn't just in terms of Israel, it was in terms of the entire world's moral compass. Because the amount to which many people and groups and societies and even governments have turned on Israel in a moment that really I felt actually should have won them much more support than previously, and instead quite rapidly it turned into the opposite. But then it went so viciously the other way, to the point that we have protests on the streets in London and elsewhere, all around the Western world, really, which are really, pre-pogrom vibe protests. People shouting out the modern equivalents of, as Einat Wilf said to me, in the talk I did with her, just put it up on my YouTube, we had it a couple of weeks ago. She said, from the river to the sea, to her, should have the same kind of moral clout as Heil Hitler. And I think that's quite jarring to say it, and it's quite hard to say it because comparisons to the Holocaust and details from that period are always difficult. But I do understand her point. It's that, it is a chant which, when you know its history, when you know the history of the people who used it, it's not just something kids say on campus. It really means something. It always has meant something. And what it means is the elimination of the state of Israel. And what that means is the elimination of the only Jewish state in the world. And what that means is the elimination of the state, which is the historic homeland of the Jewish people. And what that means is Jews have nowhere to go if the world hates them again. And guess what? Quite a lot of the world has decided it hates them again. So what's so shocking about this for me, about October the 7th, is that we really saw the measure of people. We really saw in the moment of need of the Jewish people, specifically Israeli Jews, but it quickly rippled outwards to all Jews in the world. Mm-hmm. We saw what people would do. There's always that question that my generation asked, which is, what would we have done if we'd been there during the Holocaust? Would we have stood by? Would we have felt unable to do anything? Would we have felt paralyzed? Would we have supported the persecution of Jews? What would we have done? And my father, as I referenced, was saved by extremely kind, selfless people. He was a child in Italy, and he was hidden, separated from his parents at the age of 5, hidden at first in a convent by the nuns, and then when the convents were being raided by the Nazi fascists, he was taken into the countryside and was hidden in a Catholic orphanage with orphans and one other secret Jew and his brother for 9 months, and that's why he lived. So those people did something absolutely heroic and special. They are, in my mind, superhuman, except they're not. They're humans, and we're all like them, and we can all do what they did if, God forbid, we're called on to make that decision. And what I realized since October the 7th is how many people would not make that decision. And that's why Mosab Hassan Yosef as well was a brilliant and inspiring speaker in that debate, because when he turned around to that room and he explained to them who he was and what he'd done, which is to inform on Hamas, despite being the son of a Hamas spiritual leader, he saved thousands of lives by foiling suicide bombings when he acted as a double agent for 10 years, informing the Israeli Secret Service of upcoming terrorist attacks. He saved so many lives by putting his own life at risk. Exactly what those nuns and priests did to save my father's life. They put their lives at risk because of their moral clarity. And I have seen that people who want to camp in quadrangles at elite universities don't even have a millionth of the courage that Mosab had and that my father's saviors had, and they're not even being called on to do anything. All they're being called on is not to chant genocidal pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist statements in our streets. They're not even being asked to risk their lives or to save anybody else's life. They're just being asked not to support the terrorists that burst over a border, raped, kidnapped, murdered, burnt alive, burnt dead, families, children in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. That's all. It's not a big ask. And I think so many of us understood since October the 7th that many people fell short. And just let me say quickly, many people didn't. I'm really grateful for the massive amount of people around the world who've contacted me and friends and neighbours, we all know them, who've shown an enormous amount of support. So I think that they're often just quieter and that we maybe shouldn't give up on humanity just yet.
Absolutely. And I just want to add to what you said about Mosab, who really did stand up to save. You can't quantify. How do you quantify saved lives? But by acting as a double agent. I hate the word double agent because it's so negative, but what he did was just so
and I said double agent, but I must take it back. Actually, you're right, because I did a long interview with Mosab the next day, which you can see on my YouTube, and he talks very cogently about what he did actually. And he wasn't a double agent. In fact, his loyalty wasn't particularly to Israel or to Hamas or to Palestinians. His loyalty was to his ethics and his morality and to saving human life. And he's always been clear about that in almost everything I've seen him interviewed in his book. He's always made it clear that his overriding motivation was to save life, and that his overriding principle was to work for the children of Gaza, the children of Israel, i.e. the future. So on that basis, he wasn't a double agent at all, and he wasn't a traitor, as people have called him abusively. He was actually somebody who stood very, very firmly as an individual human being of great moral value. And I cannot say enough good things about that man, because I think that many of us can argue about this as much as we like, but very few of us do truly know how we would behave if we were in a situation where we were called on to make that decision. He knows, because he did it, and he did it for 10 years, and he's carried on doing it now in the media since October the 7th, when he could have gone away quietly and lived the rest of his life out of the public view. He chose on October the 7th or 8th to put himself right back in a different firing line. And I really think that these sorts of people are who all of us should model ourselves on, whatever side of a debate we're on, because they are people who have moral clarity in a time when that is something which is increasingly rare.
Absolutely. And then he took it one step further. We know how he stood up when he had the opportunity to save lives. But when he asked the gallery specifically, if you guys knew that October 7th was about to be unleashed, would you have said anything? I don't want to, I'll let you finish what happened, but I think that for me, what's so remarkable is to have this anti-Semitism unleashed from 10/7 would be the equivalent of having anti-Americanism in the shadow of 9/11. I've never, maybe I'm naive, maybe I missed something. I've never heard or seen anything like this happen before, where these rabid masses decide to form against a victim. But that being said, when the air was sucked out of the room, or at least by those of us watching, when he asked that question, what happened?
So he, in fact, that was what was brilliant about that, because he explained who he was and what he'd done. And then he said, before he asked them that question, he said, so you guys want to teach me a lesson on morality? And I thought, that's a good point. And then he asked them, right, so if you knew about October the 7th, in the same way he'd known about suicide bombings, would you have told authorities in advance in order to save lives. And really very few people put up their hands. I mean, he said he approximated 5%. I'm not even sure it was that. Very few. We knew we were going to lose the vote at the end of that evening when they walked through the two doors, agreeing or disagreeing with the motion. But that's why I think it was very clever that he asked for that show of hands. I think that he really revealed the truth there. He highlighted what was wrong. It was the elephant in the room, which is that this isn't even about Jews. That's the point. And it's not even about Israel. So you're right that there's been a wave of anti-Semitism, but I'm trying to get across to people that this isn't about Jews only. The point is that what's been lost is any kind of moral clarity or identity among many people in the West, particularly in a younger generation. And I must say again, it's not everyone. There are some people of extraordinary moral worth, and I meet lots of them because we kind of tend to find them gravitating around this topic because they are absolutely shocked about the other side. And what they are showing us is that so many people, in not putting up their hand there, it doesn't matter if it was Jews, it doesn't matter if it was Arabs, it doesn't matter if it was children or if it was old people, it doesn't matter. If you wouldn't inform the authorities in any imaginary country, never mind specific one, about an impending massacre, about rapes, about torture, about kidnapping, if you knew about it and you wouldn't do something to stop it, there's something deeply wrong with you, whatever you think about Jews in Israel. That's exactly the point. So I think that he really hit the nail on the head with that question. And I think he really drew focus to what this debate should really have been about. And I'll add one other thing that I wanted to say earlier, if I may, which is this allegation of apartheid is particularly aggressive and nasty, but also quite stupid. Because if we are going to pick apart this conflict and look at it in its true terms, there is a side which is genocidal and pursues apartheid, and it's not Israel or the Jews. It is the Palestinian cause. The Palestinians in any territory that they have had historically full control over do not have any Jews living in it. That's a form of apartheid. Whereas Israel has a sort of 20% or so minority of Arabs living in Israeli society with full rights. And so it's clear that one side of this does have a commitment to apartheid. And it's similarly clear that by pretty much any definition of genocide, what happened on October the 7th was an attempt at genocide. It was an intentional, planned effort to kill and damage a part of a specific people, which falls within the legal definition of genocide. There were plans for it. The New York Times published minutes of the 10 meetings that Hamas had with their Iranian backers and with the input of Hezbollah, precisely planning for that event. It was in the planning for years, in fact. We've seen training videos of them actually training to carry out the assaults and the attacks in the kibbutzim and in people's homes. It was planned in detail, so much so that it was quite effective, sadly. And so I think that really we need to look at this much more clearly, not just to say Israel isn't an apartheid state, Israel isn't carrying out a genocide. We need to go the next step, which is to say, actually, Islamic terrorists are carrying out a genocide, not just in Israel. They're trying to do it every time they blow us up here in the UK, or you up in the US, or when they fly planes into the Twin Towers, or when they blew up the London Underground and a bus on 7/7, or when they blew up Manchester Arena, or when they attempted the beheading of Lee Rigby, the British soldier, on the British streets in broad daylight. And you know how I know that's what they were doing? And they were doing it in the name of their religion? Because every time they told us, Lee Rigby's killers told us that's why they were doing it. And we have a habit in the West of wanting to bury our head in the sand and say, it's not because they're Muslim, it's not because of their interpretation of Islam, it's not because of Islam's teachings, they got it wrong. when they themselves presented it to us as precisely that. I think it's time that we start recognizing the truth according to what those people told us. There was a documentary that went on the BBC here. It was a film directed by Yariv Mosab, who I also did an interview with, actually. And he is a brilliant film director. He pulled together a lot of the footage from the Nova party on October the 7th, from the people in the party and from the attackers, the Hamas attackers, and the other Palestinians who attacked. And there's one very memorable clip I remember. I think it was a dash cam piece of footage from the Palestinian terrorists invading. And they said something along the lines of, in Arabic, even if 1,000 of us die, even if 2,000 of us die, this is for the nation of jihad. That was very clear to me. I understood what their intention was. I understood what their motivation was. I understood what their ideology was. I understood what their willingness to sacrifice 1,000 or 2,000 of their own lives was. This was a very clear manifesto statement of their intentions. They were willing to die in number in order to conduct jihad against the people they were attacking and killing that day. What else did they need to tell us for us to understand how many more people need to die before we can actually accept what this is really about?
Intention matters, and it doesn't just matter in international law. And the concept of genocide, it requires intent. But even if you wanted to just take it to basic man on the street, murder versus manslaughter, what's the difference? It's intent. Everybody knows that, if I accidentally back my car over somebody, it's not the same as beheading them in their kitchen. And so I think that when I know you said it's sort of a slippery slope when not, saying river to sea is the new Heil Hitler, but it isn't. Because I would argue that what happened on 10/7 was more heinous than a lot of what happened during the Holocaust, if nothing, but because of the glee that they took in it and how much they celebrated it. I'm not the first to say this. The Nazis at least tried to hide their atrocities. They had no desire to stream this, much less on people's personal Facebook pages. I mean, the level of intention, but then also when you're talking about apartheid and genocide, if we want to talk about the real apartheid genocide states, go down the litany of accusations. We live in this inverted, it's Orwellian. There's no other word for what we're experiencing right now. How can you call Israel a colonizing state when you built your mosque on top of our temple? Right? It's so
Well, I'll say this. When it comes to the conflict, there is clearly a decades-old conflict going on between two sets of people, and there is absolutely no agreement or no strong suspicion how this could be solved. For many years, people said, we all know how this will end eventually. It will be according to X lines with agreed land swaps and blah, 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 blah. But I think in reality, many of us knew deep down that's not going to work. After October the 7th, people started to say that out loud. And I think that's because it was such a horrific moment that it set back any belief in that fantasy. And I do call it a fantasy because I think what has always been clear, but it's becoming ever clearer to more and more people, is that the mainstream Palestinian identity or Palestinian political intention has never really been to have a Palestinian state living in peace alongside a Jewish Israeli state or a majority Jewish Israeli state. Never. Because every time that has been offered, it has been rejected on any terms. And the stated aims of even the so-called moderate side of the Palestinian cause has always been that they would have two states, but that the infinitely expanding number of Palestinian refugees, according to the definition of the UN, which has a unique definition of refugee status just for Palestinians, it's inheritable forever, so that number of refugees grows, those people should be allowed a right of return to the Jewish state. So the concept has always been create two states, Israel and a Palestinian state, and allow an infinite number of Palestinians to return to the Jewish state. You don't need to be a statistician to understand that what that results in is two Palestinian states. That's not a resolution to the conflict that anyone, let alone Jews or Israelis, could possibly countenance. And if we were just more honest about that from the word go, I think quite a lot of bloodshed could have been prevented, because it's the constant attempt to force Israel into pursuing that goal which has resulted in this constant and never-ending deadlock and never-ending cycle of violence where the Palestinians attack Israel through terrorism or through this militarized invasion in this case, along with the Iranian backing for other militias in the area, from Hezbollah in the north to the Houthis in the south. It's just time that people were a bit more honest about the situation. And I think Israel's done a fantastic job in the last year. It did a terrible job on October the 7th. Everybody can see that, most of all Israelis. But since then, I think it has proven the need for its existence. Jews cannot rely on anyone else to defend us, to defend the Jewish people, when large parts of the apparently civilized Western world will abandon us like that. At least Israel understands that it's in an existential war and that it will do what it needs to defend itself against an enemy that is ruthless and has apparently no moral and ethical boundaries. And even then, Israel will try to act as much as it can within ethical and moral boundaries itself. And that is exemplary to the whole world, because that's a fight that isn't just coming to all of us. It's a fight that we're all already having to some extent or another. When these kids go on the streets and chant "globalize the Intifada," again, it's not just a cute slogan. Intifada means something. In the first and second intifadas in Israel, people died. They were blown up. Civilians, children, mothers, fathers, old, young, blown up senselessly because of who they were and where they were. And you know what? It's already happening where we live. It's already happening in London. It's already happening in Manchester. It's happening all over the world. What just happened in New Orleans? What just happened in Magdeburg in Germany, when people rammed cars into crowds to kill them at a Christmas market on New Year's Day? Symbols of Western normal life, symbols of Christianity, of our values and our lives being attacked. And how are they being attacked? In exactly the same way as Palestinians have attacked Israelis. So the Intifada has already been globalized. We need to realize what that means, and we need to start to fight it, just like Israel's been doing for decades. We need to stop condemning Israel, start learning from it.
When I speak to people like you, it soothes my nerves, as if this kind of rationality were just like, okay, and now people are going to start treating the Jewish state like every other state. I wish it were that simple. I mean, even the fact that the resolution took really apartheid and genocide, like probably the two most heinous things, because whatever, white colonialism, blah, 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 are sort of abstract. We're like, oh, but everyone gets apartheid, everyone gets genocide. So let's slap these things on the Jewish state. And so I think that on our side, there's a lot of great theory on rationality, but I think the problem is that we have a world that has been consumed by the irrational hate that quite honestly cycles from generation to generation. I mean, so we skip one generation and then comes the next one. I wish I could spend my whole life like listening to you or listening to Sam Harris or, listening to these rational actors. But
I think it's
problem.
I'm flattered that you would include me in such company. But let me say, I think that it shouldn't be revolutionary or controversial to say these things because they are basically quite common sense if you're just willing to open your mind to the ugliness of the truth. And sometimes I say that many people prefer to believe a beautiful lie than to believe an ugly truth. In this case, the beautiful lie is that these people don't mean what they said when they did these beastly things to us. And the beautiful lie is there is a way to make peace with something which has a genocidal intent towards you. But of course, we know that the ugly truth is that's not right. You can't negotiate over how many Jews should be killed because that's unthinkable. You can't decide that we can compromise on those things. So if it were truly a conflict about land, there have been numerous attempts to compromise on land. Indeed, Israel has sacrificed large parts of what it once controlled in order to make peace successfully, for example, in the case of Egypt. So I think that it's very clear that there are some areas where you can't negotiate and compromise because they are existential. So when the thing you need to negotiate with wants you dead, you can't be a little bit dead. I think we're seeing that in a much more concrete way with the hostage negotiations. They have taken civilians and soldiers hostage. They've kept them in unthinkable conditions. Many of them are now dead. They include among them 2 babies, an 85-year-old man, people with all manner of health needs and disorders. We've seen from many of them not even a sign of life once. They've been tortured. They've almost certainly been raped or sexually abused. We've heard that testimony from some who were returned or rescued or swapped for terrorists from prisons in Israel. That's a humanitarian issue. That's not about Israel or Palestinians. That's not about Jews or Muslims or Arabs. It's plain and simple. Those people need to be given back immediately. Why are the negotiations going nowhere? Even Antony Blinken now, in his last interview on his way out, has said, actually, whenever there was perceived to be public space between the US position and Israel, it emboldened Hamas to back off from making a deal. He has now said that every time the deal didn't happen when it looked like it might, it was because of Hamas. Well, this isn't news to anyone that was following this properly. This isn't news to anyone that understood that Hamas and the Palestinians were not negotiating from a position of good faith at all, ever. They were never negotiating to try to release those hostages, because if they had any intention to release them, you know what? They could just do it. They're the ones who took them. They're the ones who kept them. They're the ones who are killing them and raping them. They could just as easily give them back. They don't want to. Why would you give back something you deliberately took? Why would you give those people back? They have no humanitarian concern towards their own people. They don't care about the suffering of Palestinians. Why should we believe they care about the suffering of the Israelis they took hostage? These are the sorts of things that just need to be said out loud. And so what I say is, I hope more and more people can say them. And if any one of us saying them makes people feel, wow, that's common sense, or that's a breath of fresh air, great. Because all I ask is that everyone should start to say these things. Everyone should speak it out loud. We need to normalize these common sense, rational positions. And we need to stop allowing anyone to tell us that we're extreme for thinking them. Because if I thought I was extreme or wrong, I would not think this. I would challenge it and test it and reform what I think because it feels or seems or is wrong. I don't think that's the case.
Right. I do want to say again, like for all the time and energy that the world spends trying to accuse Israel of quote unquote war crimes. I mean, there's each one of those hostages represents a whole litany of war crimes. War, on the other hand, is not a war crime. And so again, like this inversion. But so I just want to move on from this debate and go into sort of a broader context. Because it's been an hour. Thank you for being so generous with your time. It's really impossible at this point to like even count anymore how many fronts Israel is fighting this war on. Like first it was one, Gaza. right? Then 7. We've got Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, West Bank. Then 8, we add in the media. 9, when you added in lawfare. Then we have politics, diplomacy, higher ed, lower ed. Like where does this end? I want to just sort of explore 7 different fronts and ask your evaluation of each. I know this is a lot. There are implications. You can make this as short as you want to. And ultimately, how much of a role each one plays in the outcome of this war against not just the Jewish state, and as you're saying, not just against Jews, but really just against Western values, common humanity. So I do want to start with education and academia. Of course, both faculty and students at universities across the globe are poisoning their campuses, but we can't ignore the downstream curricula of high schools, elementary schools, and even kindergartens and preschools that are also indoctrinating kids from a very early age about concepts of white guilt and the oppressed oppressor ideology. We all know that Israel and the Jews are framed as the ultimate offenders. So what role do you see our school system as playing in the rise of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and overall anti-Semitism?
I think the issue of education is a really important one, but not just for Israel and not just for how Israel comes out of this. I actually think it's far more fundamental than that, because Israel is just one example of how the rot has set in academia. And I mean to say that, of course, there's plenty of room for diversity of opinion and debate and thought within academic and educational settings. In fact, that seems to be the place where those sorts of things maybe belong. But when you allow educational settings to become places of dogma and bias and aggression towards Jews or anyone else like that, I think what you do is you close the mind of a whole generation, not just towards Israel and Jews, but towards everything. And that's what I experienced in the debate in Oxford. These were people predominantly in that room, and I don't know if they're typical of Oxford students. It was 300 or 400 people handpicked to give us a hard time that night. So maybe Oxford is not entirely like that. I hope so. But there is definitely, or appears to be, a tendency towards that style of thinking. And if teachers and professors and academics are pressuring the next generation into these positions of dogma and cancellation, cancelled speech, cancelled thought, and if there are topics that you're not allowed to think a certain way on, then we're really in trouble. Not just Israel, all of us. And I, for example, often reference the whole trans debate in that. It is one of these things that cannot be the subject of a rational and calm discussion. If somebody's mind and their body are not in harmony in terms of what they think their gender is, there seems to be a massive pressure towards changing their body to realign it with their mind, and almost no acceptance of the idea that maybe we could try to work with people's minds to realign it with the reality of their body. Now, that is my opinion on this topic. It is not a lack of sympathy or empathy for people with that problem, but it's almost forbidden to express that unless you are in a position where you can't be cancelled or aren't afraid of it. Certainly in an academic setting, it seems to be a very problematic position. But I think that academia and education are coming round to understanding that this level of dogma and aggression towards rational or free thought is actually producing a worse product in terms of the students that come out the other end. And I think fairly quickly, perhaps after January the 20th in particular, these things might turn around somewhat, and you might find that the Ivy Leagues and similar are more aware of the importance of actually educating rather than reprogramming and brainwashing.
Well, they have a Hamasnik teaching Zionism at Columbia, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Let's go on to number 2. So pretty much at the confluence, right, of academia and social media comes this very conversation is due to the Oxford Union debate and its propagation all over social media that I reached out to you to see if you'd be a guest on my show. Social media is just so far reaching. It can catapult any idea around the globe many times over in a matter of seconds. Add in the influencer multiplier, and not just ideas, but dangerous lies and propaganda spread like wildfire and are nearly impossible to retract. So how important do you think the rise of social media, particularly, of course, over the last decade, has changed the landscape of public opinion? And I am speaking vis-a-vis Israel and the Jewish people, because the world is just a little too broad of a plate right now to dig into.
Israel's in a really difficult position because I think it's very difficult to explain or put across some of the dilemmas that it finds itself in and facing. So when it comes to social media by definition finds short, pithy answers to very difficult and complex questions. And I think that there's a tendency to take very, very strong views, as I said earlier, about things where maybe nuanced and complex views are more appropriate. So I think that when it comes to social media, it's such a broad topic, but there are different problems with different elements of it. For example, TikTok is problematic, not just because of its Chinese ownership and the potential influence of the Chinese Communist Party, but also because of the nature of the app. It's quite a brilliant app if you use it. It's very engaging, it's very sticky, you just swipe through. It doesn't even really require you to like or subscribe to things. It learns from your behavior and how you use it exactly what to give you next that will keep you engaged or keep you interested. But I think we know from social media having existed long enough now for academics to have studied it, that form of feedback loop often pushes us to extreme versions of what we think or feel. And so I will try to stick to Israel, but another good example in that case is eating disorders. I know that there has been quite a lot of academic investigation into how people with body dysmorphia or tendencies that way can look at social media, and the algorithms quickly understand that that's a concern to them, and it pushes them towards more and more extreme videos and content about body size, body modification, controlling one's eating, etc. The same is true of Israel. So if you have a small amount of information, a small opinion towards one way or another, I think that the algorithms are bound to feed you with more of that rather than necessarily to challenge you. And I don't know the answer. I think nobody knows the answer at this stage, but there is obviously a very big problem with it. Maybe Israel can get better, or people who believe in Israel or defend Israel can get better at using social media. But I think that it's more complex than that. I think that we're probably as a species going to have to come round to finding some rules and some norms that we maybe apply to algorithmic suggestions in the future that maybe will counter that.
There's also a numbers game that I think puts Israel permanently behind the eight ball on. But also the problem with these echo chambers, quite frankly, is that you had mentioned before that when we're in college, we all get wrapped up in these passions and these emotions. And the problem is that this echo chamber is getting louder and louder, and our world is becoming more and more polarized because we're being pushed into corners. And maybe I'm a pessimist. I don't see these kids growing out of it the way that the Vietnam generation did.
Who knows? I mean, time will tell. I do think that every generation does tend to learn more and soften its views in certain areas. But you're right that we maybe aren't seeing that as much, or maybe because of the influence of the internet and social media, actually we might see the opposite. We might see a hardening of those opinions. But I also think that there is, see, I keep saying, I think there's a really important job to be done in separating Israel and Jews out from this. It is a fundamental part of it, but it's, I think, in some ways a symptom, not a cause. only in some ways, because in other ways, hatred of Jews is as old as time and is quite a motivating factor in and of itself. But I think that if you play a numbers game, as you said, you might be right. But I think that the numbers game is falsely interpreted by saying Jews or Israelis are in a massive minority or a tiny minority. I think the reality is that if we truly understand what we in the West value, that is in common with Jews in Israel, you'll realize that actually there are many, many millions of us who should be defending things that are fundamental and important to us, regardless of Israel and Jews. It just so happens that Jews and Israel are at the forefront of the attack on those things.
Sure.
I would defend the teenage girls who were killed in Manchester Arena at the Ariana Grande concert. I would defend the right of teenagers to have fun, to listen to music, to party. I would defend the right of people to drink alcohol. I would defend the right of people to live Western lives based loosely on our Judeo-Christian values. But even put that aside, I would defend democracy and what we tend to call liberal values. As a gay person, never mind as a gay person, but even if I weren't, I would defend the rights of gay people. All of these things are challenged by the very causes that many people are now actually fighting for. For example, Hamas. Palestinian society isn't great on most of those issues. So I think that there will be a realignment in terms of numbers, I hope, where people realize that actually we're much stronger in numbers than we think if we truly understand what we're actually defending.
From your mouth to God's ears, as they say in the old country. Okay, number 3, mass media.
Mass media is where I work sometimes, and as a journalist. And I'll say this, it's struggling, and I think it's struggling quite rightly. I just put a massive thread on my X yesterday, actually, about BBC anti-Semitism, because I've spent a lot of my career talking and investigating and writing about that. And the BBC, for example, it's almost, upfront and direct about it. It's constantly gaslighting and trolling Jews. From the time when they, a couple of years ago, reported that a bus full of Jewish children who'd gone to celebrate Hanukkah in Oxford Street in London, who were assaulted and attacked and had to flee in their bus, the BBC reported that those kids had uttered a anti-Muslim slur. And the Jewish community undertook very expensive forensic audio analysis of this ropey bit of video that the BBC claimed had Jewish children, Lubavitch Chabad Jewish children, saying dirty Muslims. And in fact, what they were saying in Hebrew was, it's an emergency, bring help. So the fact that that sort of thing, they eventually apologized. They were found by Ofcom, the regulator here, to have done pretty poorly in that. But to have dragged that reluctant apology out of them, that's just one example. I gave a whole load in that thread. It shows that there is a massive problem in the legacy media. But thanks, I think, to things like YouTube, to podcasts, to, dare I say it, Elon Musk, bringing back freedom of speech and removing a lot of the censorship and manipulation that had found its way even into new media like Twitter. Thanks to that, I think there is a massive fight back going on.
Now we're back into the concept of social media again.
Yeah, but this is one of the places where social media can be good. That's my point, because were it not for Joe Rogan's 3-hour interview of Donald Trump, we might have taken Kamala Harris's 5-minute press conference about him being an actual Nazi seriously. But after watching him for 3 hours, even if you didn't like Donald Trump, most people I know who didn't like Trump watched it and said, the guy's kind of normal. He's not the ogre they told me he was. He speaks like a regular person, not like a politician. Now, Donald Trump's not a regular person, don't get me wrong. I'm trying to say here that I think that the social media and the internet has some power of good to counter the problem in the legacy media. But
obviously, you're in BBC world, I'm here in New York Times world, where, Barry Weiss obviously left the New York Times for the same reason, started the Free Press. And so It's been in NPR, CNN. I mean, go down the list. There's definitely an anti-Israel agenda because of this whole like weird David and Goliath paradigm, and the news wants to sell news. I don't know if it's deliberate that they understand like with the broad repercussions it has for the world Jewish community when they spend so much time and effort undermining Israel. And then they'll do some article about anti-Semitism. And it's like, do you understand? Like, you're the one who poisoned the well.
I like to give credit where it's due. These are smart people. They're my contemporaries and your contemporaries. I know people who work in these places, or I know of people who are at university with me or whatever. They're smart enough. They can see this if they want to. Either they are willfully blind or they are deliberately doing this, in my opinion. There is a certain amount of groupthink that goes into reinforcing prejudices, but it doesn't take much to understand in numerous examples just how wrong they were. I mean, another BBC example, it's Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen, a veteran presenter on the BBC with a long-standing animosity towards Israel, reported early on in this war that Israel had flattened a hospital in Gaza. The hospital wasn't flattened by anyone, and what happened was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket hit the car park, the parking lot. Now, no hospital was flattened, so just on pure journalistic basis, this is a very big failing in reporting. But when he was finally challenged on it, he said, "I don't regret anything about my reporting. I got that wrong. I don't feel so bad about that." Now, I mean, that's quite shameless, in my opinion. If you literally said a hospital had been flattened and it hadn't, regardless of the rest of the story, you ought to be a little bit embarrassed about the way that you reported that, because you effectively assumed or made up something that didn't happen. Mistakes can be made, but these are intelligent thinking people who have the capacity to understand what they're doing. So I don't let them off the hook so easily as to say, well, they're stuck in an echo chamber and a loop and they can't get out of it. They can. Many people have.
Sure. Immediate retractions have never been effective. It's like when you're a lawyer, you know that you say something that's going to be struck from the record, but somebody also can't unhear it. So lawyers will purposely like throw in information knowing it's going to be struck from the record, but there's no way that the jury is going to pretend that they did not hear that, even if they don't bring it up in deliberations. It's been implanted. Okay, number 4. So let's get into the UN. There's no doubt that the UN and all the international bodies and NGOs, I'm going to clump these together, present yet another layer of complexity in the anti-Israel landscape. Because of their perceived credibility, people are reluctant to say out loud that there's an overt anti-Semitic agenda at play. I'm not. And there's nothing far-fetched or unreasonable about stating the obvious about a horrible phenomenon that has occurred repeatedly throughout history. I mean, year after year, we have more UN Security Council resolutions against Israel, not just the only Jewish state, but also a democratic state, than against all other nations combined. And the ridiculous rulings of the ICC, the ICJ, to which Israel isn't even a party, drive the nail into the coffin of their legitimacy. As Ireland and South Africa are scrambling to redefine genocide so as to apply it to what's happening in Gaza, not to mention the pseudo-human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, such nice names, these bodies are executing Olympic caliber mental gymnastics to incriminate Israel whenever and wherever they can. Do you see any way at all for Israel to get a fair shake in the diplomatic arena?
I mean, I echo a lot of what you just said, so I'll save the time and not repeat it. And I don't know. Things can change. Trump, in his first term, defunded UNRWA, the UN body that's specifically dedicated towards looking after Palestinian refugees and the whole Palestinian side of things. not because he's a nasty man who doesn't like Palestinians, but actually we've since seen during this war in particular what many people knew already, but it's become very mainstream information. UNRWA is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Many of the terrorists that took part in October the 7th were actually UNRWA employees, UNRWA teachers. Given that that's the case, UNRWA facilities were used for terrorist purposes. Almost impossible that they didn't know that. Those sorts of things make it very clear that UNRWA is basically so corrupted by Hamas and Palestinian terrorism that it's not really fit for purpose, and there should be other international bodies which are dedicated towards the welfare and humanitarian causes essential for innocent civilian Palestinians. And I think that it does them no service that they are actually supposedly being looked after by a corrupted pseudo-humanitarian body like that. I think that has become clear to many people. Does it mean there will be a change? I don't know, but certainly the way that those changes tend to happen is from the top. So the US is still quite a powerful player in all of this, and therefore should the Trump administration decide to take bold steps as it did in the past, this could be the catalyst for that change. And again, I would say that October the 7th was horrific, and yet it brought about many extraordinary shifts in the Middle East. And so it may yet bring about many extraordinary shifts in the diplomatic arena and the humanitarian arena as well. If we thought just 2 years ago that the Middle East would look as it does now in terms of Hezbollah having been massively debilitated, the Iranians having had their air defenses massacred, having been struck by Israel directly, Syria as it is, etc., Hamas in Gaza as it is, I don't think many of us could have imagined that that would be the case today, back then. So similarly, I like to think that maybe such a change could happen in other arena that would be beneficial to the whole world as well, but I'm not holding my breath on it.
I'll just add on to that 80 years ago, if anyone would have ever said that Germany, with that, first of all, there would be a Jewish state, but that second of all, Germany would be one of their strongest allies, I think we would have had the same conversation. So ultimately, I guess that's where the tikva, so to speak, is, that the only thing that stays the same is change, right? It's the only constant is change. Okay. So, sorry, did you have something else to add?
I was just going to say, sometimes it's things from outside the ordinary. It's the unexpected, massive events that change other things. And I think October the 7th is one of those. So it might happen yet, and there might be other such massive events that will help, a sort of domino effect or a ripple effect. So I think that's always what's unknown, and we can analyze and chart things as best we can and plan for them. But I think in reality, what Israel's shown in the last year and a half or so is that often the best strategists are the ones who can react lightning fast to opportunities and disasters alike, in order to come out with a good result. And what Israel did in Syria is a great example of that. The Assad regime fell, and within days, Israel had done something that the US, the French, the UK had not been able to do in taking out the chemical weapons capability there, etc., etc. It had changed it completely changed the board. It swept much of the danger off the board. And those sorts of things happen when the opportunities arise.
And keep in mind that the dominoes are falling from both directions, right? So we've got the war dominoes, but we've got the peace dominoes, right? That started with the Abraham Accords, right? So if we've got, so we can win this war with war from the inside, expanding out, or we could do it from peace from the outside in. And the fact that both are being fought, and I might argue that there probably won't be an Iranian regime on January 6th of next year. I think that once Iran takes that hit, I think the entire new world order is going to form, and that maybe some of them is by twisting their thumbs, and maybe it's some of them that just realize, like, any country that's in alliance with Israel is going to be enhanced in so many ways that it definitely behooves people once they can, like what you said about the people at the Oxford Union, you get so entrenched in your ideas that it hurts to be wrong. But once you swallow that pill, maybe these people will wake up to understanding like the fruits of actually, even if it's not an easy peace. I mean, I wouldn't call what we have with Egypt and Jordan peace, but it's peaceful enough. You know,
Right.
it's
And
not
I think that
war.
the Abraham Accords, by the way, is obviously very important. And as you mentioned it, it's worth saying that the Abraham Accords was brilliant and again bold in terms of the three world leaders who were instrumental in making it happen. And I would say that that was all great, and it was a good roadmap for the future, which is one of the reasons that Hamas decided to do what it did on October the 7th, was that the Palestinian cause was being fast left behind, in their opinion, and possibly in reality, because other much more important Arab populations, Arab states, were realizing exactly what you just said, that a Middle East with a healthy, thriving Jewish state and normalized relations with that state was going to be beneficial to everyone, not detrimental. I think that the Abraham Accords, sadly, always were going to need to be tested. And boy, have they been tested, because I think there was the expectation or hope on the part of the Palestinians that October the 7th would undo or reverse or stop the future of the Abraham Accords. And I'm not convinced that's happened at all. I think once Trump is back in, especially after the war that Israel has fought, there is every possibility and opportunity that that will continue to be the path that the Middle East takes into the future. And I think that is, in a way, again, it's hard to say that anything good came out of this war, because war is never good, and what triggered it certainly was not good, and what has happened to many people during it is not good. Yet the strengthening of those alliances with those countries, or at least the withstanding of that pressure, is very, very important. So I think if we do see Saudi Arabia, for example, entering into that circle of peace, as they called it, and it does seem a much warmer peace in many ways than the Egyptian or Jordanian peace with Israel. So it is definitely an interesting model, and I think it's one that will continue to be pursued.
Yeah. Okay, let's get down to more of a local level. Coming from America, President Biden has had, how should I say, a very mixed role in the state of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the US. On one hand, he proudly declares himself a Zionist. And I could tell you, as somebody who's been involved with AIPAC for decades, I actually do believe him. He was the first sitting US president to visit Israel during wartime, and he has a decades-long record of supporting the Jewish state. But on the other hand, he's been so busy supporting the jihadi segment of his voter base that he also spent an inordinate amount of time and energy publicly denigrating and undermining Israel and throwing fuel tank upon fuel tank onto the anti-Semitic inferno. And I would argue that he's actually been among the best of the state leaders around the globe these last 16 months. And don't get me started on like Starmer and Lammy and the Labor Party. I don't know if you want to go there. You're welcome to. That's not my area of expertise, but I have my opinions because I have opinions on everything. But how much do you think that the public statements of world leaders and politicians, regardless of the actual actions that they take, right? I don't care if if Biden gives Israel $8 billion worth of arms, but then tells the world that Israel is committing war crimes. Like, so I'm glad he's taking the actions, but how much do you think the public statements of world leaders and politicians affect the overall state of anti-Israel sentiment?
Well, that's always been the sort of dirty little game that some world players have played, which is support Israel in reality, but publicly condemn it and add to the assault on its reputation and what have you. And that's a two-way thing as well. It's not just support Israel, but it's accept Israel's support, because Israel is fundamental in some of these relationships in giving back. Israel's intelligence has saved lives around the world. In outside of Israel, for example, just one example, there is an enormous amount of cooperation that's two-way. So I don't think it's good for states generally to partake in those kind of relations with Israel, those strong and good relations during war and during non-war times, but externally to court any part of an electorate or population by constantly denigrating the state that it's actually working with quietly behind the scenes. I just don't think that's sustainable or sensible, and above all else, it's not honest. So I think that in terms of Biden, he did do a few things which were very good, and ultimately, without the US's permission, say so, Israel could not have continued the war as long as it has. That goes without saying. On the other hand, it's not new for me to say it. Biden and Harris massively hindered certain parts of this war, costing unquestionably large numbers of Palestinian lives. The prevarication over whether Israel should be allowed to go into Rafah, Kamala Harris's poor map reading when she said she'd looked at the maps, it's not possible for them to evacuate the civilian population. They did fairly quickly. These sorts of things were, for whatever reason, unhelpful, if I can use British understatement, and throttling of arms deliveries or sales to Israel at times also unhelpful. So I would say all of those things were problematic. They don't detract from the fact that Biden did ultimately, in general, in the broad picture, support Israel and come to her aid in a number of ways. So I think that's, that's part of the confusion of Joe Biden, but confusion is pretty much the word that sums the guy up. We only needed to watch the final debate, the last nail in his coffin, to realize that the guy is not sharp, not what he was, confused, contradictory, and none of his policies in terms of the Middle East made much sense for the US either, regardless of Israel. I think that the US has sent mixed messages towards Iran, towards others in the Middle East for a very long time. Perhaps there'll be some clarity under Donald Trump. Perhaps, nobody knows. But I suspect there will be. I think he's far more determined in that sort of way. And I think that his kind of, legendary deal-making tendencies are his style, his approach are perhaps much better. They're a much better fit for the Middle Eastern way. I think it's much more transactional and much more frank, and has a great degree of stick as well as carrot.
All that Biden really had to do, instead of saying over and over again, I support Israel, and then saying something to directly undermine them, which actually undermined himself as well and his own credibility, all he had to say was something like, I support Israel and they are not creating starvation because, 1.2 million tons of aid have been given to God. Like, all he had to do was support his own argument to validate both himself and the Jewish state. I do believe that had a tremendous effect on people. Are like, well, look, even the president is saying it,
I just think it would make sense to say what you mean, and also, though, I'm not saying that he didn't say what he meant necessarily. I don't think there was clarity of thought. I don't think there was a joined up strategy or plan, or if there was, it wasn't an effective one, it certainly wasn't one that had Israel's best interests at heart. But Israel, I think one of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu is undoubtedly good at is withstanding external pressure. Whether it's domestically against him personally, or whether it's internationally against the state of Israel and its needs during a war or outside of a war. He withstood 8 years of quite aggressive pressure from Barack Obama, and he withstood pressure from Biden during this war, which was also done in, as I said, this kind of split personality way, where there was a great degree of support, but there was also a great degree of hindrance. And Benjamin Netanyahu at times had to deal with that and managed to keep going. But I repeat, it dragged the war on longer than it needed to. It cost more lives, probably more Palestinian lives than it needed to. It didn't benefit the Palestinians. I mean, that humanitarian pier, for example, that they built off the coast of Gaza,
Right.
is just one example of the most confused thinking of the Biden administration. It made no sense at any point for that to happen. For the pier to be built and administered by a local construction company, paid for, I think it was, by the Qataris or contracted through them. It was effectively administered by a Hamas-linked construction company. It ended up costing the life of one US serviceman. These sorts of things are just bizarre when you just think back to it. It didn't seem like a good idea at the time. So rather than this sort of performative, theatrical humanitarian aid effort, they could have acknowledged that the shortcomings in humanitarian aid getting towards Palestinians was not a result of Israel not opening enough crossings or there not being enough plane drops, but actually as being a result of the fact that once inside the Gaza Strip, Hamas were stopping the aid from getting to the Palestinian people. And if they were allowing it to, they were selling it to them to continue to finance their war effort. It's pretty simple. I don't know why they couldn't just say that. Perhaps, again, it's back to that beautiful lie versus an ugly truth.
That's right. Okay. So the sixth element. So you just came out of the Oxford Union debate. So you have this insider's understanding of just how threatening and violent these situations really are. So beyond those hallowed halls, we have rioting mobs vandalizing cities and even threatening law enforcement who usually just back down. Terrorist sympathizers are disrupting societies across the globe. And of course, they're the Tentifada college encampments. If you can look beyond the pro-Israel community, what effect do you think these violent demonstrations have on the average person on the street? I'm curious if you think that it does more to attract or repulse, and how valuable you really think it is to shine light on the darkness.
Well, I find a lot of this approach repulsive, certainly, and I know a lot of people who do, but then that maybe isn't surprising because they're the people that are, in my orbit, in my life, and we often find ourselves among people who think a bit like us. I will say that even a very large and noisy encampment or protest or riot, the whole purpose of such things is to disproportionately present a view, which is to say that it's not a mainstream view, or most people would be doing it. They're not. It's a noisy minority of people that do these things. So I think the important element is how we police it or react to it. All societies have different opinions, a diversity of opinions in them. Some of them have obnoxious opinions and some of them have obnoxious behaviors. But how we react to those behaviors is what makes us a strong and principled society or state or country. And I think that you're right to say that policing is quite a big deal. These things need to be policed properly. Students should be able to go to college or university or school freely, whatever their views, whoever they are, whatever their identity, without intimidation. This predates October the 7th. It goes back to the era of BDS, for example, the boycott, divestment and sanction bullying strategy. There's nothing wrong with boycotting something if you, for your own reasons, wish not to buy it, partake in it, whatever. But there is something wrong with bullying other people who want to partake in it. That's not a boycott, that's intimidation. So I think that all of these things, what they have in common is the intention to intimidate. And we mustn't put up with that, whether it comes from a strongly held political view, whether it comes from a misguided geopolitical outlook, or whether it comes from a 7th century religious view. If it runs contrary to our freedoms, we need to police it and stop it so that we can protect our freedoms. I think from my position where I'm standing, it doesn't show those people in a good light. I don't know how it feels standing in other positions. I think there are students and younger people who are maybe inspired by it, and that's a worry for me. And I hope that that isn't the majority. And I hope that, again, with bolder, stronger leadership in certain parts of the world, maybe now in Canada, who knows, we might see these things being properly policed. Here in the UK, you touched on it. I think we've gone the other way briefly. It's a whole other discussion, maybe for another time. But our current government has what many have called a two-tier approach to policing, one which has put people in prison in 48 hours for social media posts that were deemed to be inciting, and yet have let other people walk free or go without even being charged or tried for much worse things. So I don't think it's going to happen all at once, but I do hope that the world is waking up to the realities of this, and that the policing of this kind of intimidation and bullying will get better rather than worse, and that will mean that we can enjoy our freedoms again. If that doesn't happen, the results are not going to be good.
I think that the issue is that they're so loud that even if people disagree with the rioting, all they hear is these arguments, over and over again, what Enoch calls a placard strategy. And so, like them or hate them, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, but they have a point, because it's even if it's not the dominant
something sticks.
feeling, it's a dominant discourse.
Something can stick. And I think that's why we do have a duty to counter it. But on the other hand, I think there is also a sort of market force element of it. If you have campuses which allow this to happen and which make life hostile and the environment hostile for Jews, for example, but not just Jews, just sensible people who don't want to be caught up in all that, they're quickly going to stop going to those colleges. They're not, especially in the States, they're not cheap places to be. If you make your college unwelcoming and hostile towards Jews, you will soon find they maybe go somewhere else. And that will be horrible for Jews, but I think ultimately it will be more horrible for the universities and campuses that take that choice.
I think that as grown-ups, we all are saying the same thing. And I could tell you, in reality, ultimately, every kid wants to go to the best school they can. And the kids that I know who applied, I have three nephews that applied to college last year. And I know tons of people whose kids go this year. So both of them relevant to what is going on campuses. And every single kid was like, I know what's going on, but I still want to go to fill in the blank, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Cornell, it doesn't matter. So I think that we talk about this a lot in theory, and it's not even nice. I mean, we can't call a Jude and Fry, campus situation nice. If all the Jews are at yeshiva and everybody else is somewhere else, that it's not really the solution either.
But there will be a tipping point, I think. Eventually there will be. I just don't see. It's not sustainable. If the requirement for being somewhere is that you're basically subjugated, silenced, bullied, effectively given dhimmi status, then yes, there will be some people
and a Harvard or Oxford diploma.
Yeah, fine. Look, I went to Oxford, not because of anti-Semitism. I did not enjoy my time at Oxford. As I love telling people, but I stayed there because it's a nice badge of honor and it's a great degree to have at the end of it. But I, largely speaking, didn't have the best time there. So I do understand the concept of enduring something that's not pleasant. But I think that we're talking about something much more fundamental here, and eventually, unless we stop these things and we limit them, it will become more and more dangerous. And when danger is involved, I don't think, famously Jews have not always got out in time, but I do think that because of that, there will be some shift. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just can't see that people will continue to willingly send people into that lion's den when possibly other colleges will improve their offerings, and maybe Jews will create their own spaces in some regard. And I'm not saying that's a desirable idea, that we should ghettoize education, but I just think that there are many alternatives these days, and college is a more and more luxury pursuit. So I think that given that it is an expensive and luxury pursuit, even here in the UK, not quite the same as there, I do think people will eventually vote with their feet somewhat. And I mean, down on a much more fundamental level, the more hostile and unpleasant a place gets to live for Jews, the fewer Jews are going to want to live in that place. And that's a disaster. France is fast moving that way, that, that it's horrible to watch, but people have been killed for being Jewish in France for, well over a decade now. There's nothing new about it. And we saw what happened in Amsterdam recently. These things, they're not invisible, and the first people who see them are Jews.
Right. Sure. It's been my prediction for the last year that within 5 years, Yeshiva University will be a top 10 school in America, because I think there's going to be, to an extent, a brain drain of both students and faculty. It's already a great school, and you're unlikely to witness any anti-Semitism there. The problem here is that first tier, second tier, third tier, even the community colleges, are having the same anti-Semitic issues. So I'm not even sure where the refuge is. So it's like, okay, well, if I could either go to, Santa Monica Community College and be bullied by the SJP there, or I could go to Harvard and be bullied by SJP there, I guess I'll take Harvard.
Yeah, maybe in that situation I can understand the choice, but you'll be better informed than me on US colleges. But who knows? We will see. We'll have to watch and see.
Yeah. So you talked. It's funny. I've never heard anybody use the word noisy minority. I love that, because my last element I want to talk about is the silent majority. I don't know if you even said that deliberately or not, but I think you might have just coined a phrase. So poll after poll in America shows about like 80% or even higher, honestly, support for Israel in the general populace. And that includes the 18 to 29-year-olds who, for reasons we've already discussed, are basically a lost cause at the moment. Assuming these statistics are true, does a silent majority even matter as long as they stay so very, very very silent?
I love this idea of a silent majority, and lots of us talk about it without really knowing if it exists. That's the problem with silent things, is you can't quite tell if they're there sometimes. So I know a lot of people who tell me they quietly agree with me on issues, and not just Israel, but they're scared to say so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that fear lies at the bottom of this, as it does with so many things in modern life and modern thinking. So my hope is that we can make it less scary to express those views of this so-called silent majority, because I think they're silent for a reason. So for my part, I see it as a duty to speak clearly and calmly about these topics and issues, so that people can see there are conversations going on which are rational and calm and fair, which they might be able to identify with or learn from or even agree with. And I think there are people doing that more and more. And I think that, again, these things feed on each other, and they feed on a more intangible, nebulous kind of mood. So those things, that mood can be set by our leaders from the top down. So it could be that a change in leadership in the US will make a less, for want of a better word, woke outlook more acceptable to express out loud. It may be that it comes from the bottom up, and that movements like all the supporters of the very controversial figure Tommy Robinson in the UK empower people to feel that they can express views which once, not that long ago, were quite normal and uncontroversial, but now seem radical and extreme. So I think that it's hard to know which direction that mood will change from. But these things have a habit of working in a cycle. And so I believe that each one of us can do our best to think about these things calmly and think about ways that we can persuade those around us or just discuss them with those around us. And that's the way that the silent majority becomes a little bit less silent. And I do like to talk of a noisy minority. It is a phrase that I use often because I think that that is really what instills the fear into people. Whether it's the Free Palestine Brigade or the BLM protesters or any kind of social terrorist, as I like to call them, if your method of trying to convince other people is one of violence or intimidation or bullying, it shows a weakness in your argument, in my opinion. And I think that it is understandable when people are afraid of that sort of behavior. It's true also in the eco movement that if you have a strong and valid argument, it must not rely on you deliberately inconveniencing and punishing people who disagree with you. You need to persuade them. That's what makes us human, is our ability to discuss and think these things. However, it is scary when people bully you, from the smallest example to of, say, social ostracization or cancellation, to the biggest example, killing you because you hold the wrong view, as has been the case in lots of ex-Muslims or anti-Muslim campaigners who have had their lives ended or been seriously injured or damaged. I'm thinking of people, of course, like Salman Rushdie or Theo van Gogh, or people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who have to have security all through their lives. Those are scary. Both ends of that spectrum are scary. And yet the way that we will stop making it scary is by being a little bit braver, each one of us, and speaking out and learning that there are more of us around, gathering ourselves together, realizing that what we want to defend is worth defending. And that's how I think we'll make the silent, let's not call them a majority because we really don't know, the silent blob, making them less silent.
Let's get the silent blob. I like that much better. Okay, so here's the hard question. I know I threw you so many softballs today. So given these 7 forces: education, social media, mass media, international bodies, world leaders, useful idiots, and the silent blob, can you put them 1 to 7? Who do you think has the most and least influence in this conversation specifically about anti-Israel and or anti-Semitic sentiment?
Well, I'm going to not answer it in a hierarchical way because
Okay.
I think that they exist in a cycle. So I think that, as I just said, things can happen from the bottom up or the top down, and sometimes those things work together. So I think that the election of Donald Trump is an example of that. I think that the next Trump presidency will have an enormous effect on social moods and climates. And I think that Trump probably won the election because of a bottom-up resentment with manipulation and lying in the mainstream media and things like that, as well as general dissatisfactions that typically go into electoral choices. So I think that Trump is there because of a bottom-up movement. But on the way, there was also the intervention of Elon Musk and social media, which sort of democratized the media world and then dragged the traditional media and educational institutions somewhat away from their extreme woke, radical Democrat positions. And I'm not just talking about Israel, I'm talking on all sorts of issues, but Israel is a big one. So I think all these things feed into each other. But the most obvious two, which seem to then trigger all the others, are the top-down world leaders and bottom-up social movements. So I think that those will be perhaps the two catalysts that then get the whole thing working in a kind of beautiful cycle, hopefully, and that one thing will lead to another. But as I said, it's always the thing that you didn't know that comes from outside that has the most change, either for good or for bad. So I don't want to make any foolish predictions.
Well, I mean, I guess the nature of a cycle is that it's circular nature, and also that something can be counter circular because each thing feeds into the next. Okay, so my thoughts on this are that it starts with education, and I think our big problem is that here in America, at least, we're onto our indoctrination of a third generation now. This started around the 90 turn of the century, let's say, and they say that it takes 2 generations to unindoctrinate. And once you get to the third, where your parents and your grandparents, oh, I guess never mind, that's second generation, are already on the same page, it comes really hard when 2 generations are telling you the same thing, and that your teachers in school are telling you that. And then these kids, number 2, go into the social media realm. They scream, they shout, they get their attention. I know there's a lot of people who think that the Tentifada is really only an attention grabbing thing in the first place. As Sam Harris said, everybody now has like a TV studio in their pocket, and you could have instant fame, which goes to the mass media, where our older generations actually still get news and information, because younger generations are generally getting most of their news from TikTok. And I don't want to underemphasize, again, these are our next generations of leaders. These aren't just random kids, and they are getting their information from TikTok. Then I would say the world leaders that set a national tone in tolerance or intolerance. Look what's happening with Albanese in Australia. I mean, his speeches against anti-Semitism are so weak. And so what's happening is spiraling up and up and up and out of control. Then I think are like the UN and stuff. I think the danger with them, because I think personally, they're completely illegitimate at this point. They don't even adhere to their own definitions. We didn't even get into the definitions really specifically of apartheid and genocide. But I have other podcasts, and so do you, that address those issues. So even as they delegitimize themselves, I think the man on the street still thinks that these are very noble institutions that only have the world's best interests at heart. At number 6, I do have the useful idiots, the people who are getting all the attention, who are screaming, who are shouting, who are breaking windows, that even if people don't agree with them, I think that ultimately they're like, okay, but they do have a point. I think there's like a sort of okay, but ism with that. And then finally is the silent majority. If people don't start speaking up and shifting the narrative and stop being afraid, and ironically, we're talking about speaking against terror. Like, the silent majority the silent part should be the people who are embarrassed to stand up for terror. And again, this like weird inverse morality is, it's really dangerous. And I do want to believe that, as Anne Frank so famously said, most people are good. And I think that if that's all it takes is for good people to start speaking up, and we can shift this whole narrative. So I did do the 7. That being said, Jonathan, thank you for being so incredibly generous with your time. Is there anything that you do want to add before we go? And I think that I always like to finish with like the hope, Hatikva, where's the hope in all this? But I find you to be one of the most hopeful people that I've encountered when it comes to the possibility of a brighter future. So is there anything that you want to add or end on a note of hope?
So I'm not often accused of being an optimist, so thank
Really?
you for that. I will say that I did realize at one point in my life that I am more of an optimist than I realized previously. But let's say I think I oscillate at the moment wildly between days or weeks of optimism and the opposite, because things are so very bad in so many ways, and yet the changes that we've seen, if you look backwards, are so enormous, and some of them are so very positive in other ways, that it's hard to know yet, in the thick of it, which one is going to win out. And there are so many moving parts and so many variables to this that things could be very, very good in a couple of years, or God forbid, very, very bad, or somewhere in between. So I suspect that we don't get to choose the era we're born into. And we have been born, as the Chinese saying goes, in interesting times. This is our lot. We have to get through it. But I think that each one of us has the power and ability to make smart decisions. And as you said, we've got so much power individually today with the influence we can have over those close to us and even those far away, whether it's the TV studio in your pocket or just your ability through the internet, social media, phones, and all of that to find out more from a variety of places and to hear more views and to see more things for yourself. And with that goes the responsibility of learning critical thinking, reading, viewing, and understanding what it is you're watching and who showed it to you. But I think human beings are generally quite resourceful and creative, and I think that we tend to find our way out of crises and emergencies. But as Einat Wolf said, actually, Jews have a timing problem, which is even though things might be all right in the end, it's often the Jews who suffer in the beginning. So I hope that that's not going to be the case this time, and I don't want to end on a downer, so I'll say that maybe it won't be, and with more conversations, hopefully we'll come to more clarity and about what it is that we're all fighting for and what's worth defending.
Well, thank you so much. Not just for being here, but for really speaking on behalf of the entire Jewish people with such moral clarity, that you are just a very, very important voice in a moment in time. So
thank you. And I'm just pleased I didn't have to do any yoga because I was worried about that.
Oh, well, now is the part where we do the yoga. So
downward dog time, right?
Yeah, well, that's coming next. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.